What's going on, everybody? Welcome to Pondering Christianity. This week, I wanted to discuss with you guys what we can and cannot take seriously from near-death experiences. This is also relevant to apologetics in the sense of representing what apologetics is pretty much trying to do within the conversation between a non-theist and a theist. So, without further ado, let's dive in. The way I'm going to present this today is like a court case, or rather, that's really what the discussion between, say, an apologist and a skeptic or an atheist would relate closest to. One is simply saying that the evidence is not sufficient in convincing them of the outcome, i.e., God exists, and the other one is saying that the evidence is absolutely sufficient and not guaranteeing the fact that God exists, but simply saying that the evidence is enough to convince you that there is a God, and he is in fact the particular God of Christianity. That would be ultimately what the Christian apologist is trying to accomplish. Now, with that being said, you have two types of evidence when taking into consideration within a legal parameters, okay? And that is, let me pull it up for you here. You have direct evidence and you have circumstantial evidence, okay? So direct evidence is based on personal knowledge or observation. Circumstantial evidence, which is primarily what Christians have, is indirectly establishes a fact, okay? And so theism would be on the side of saying, look, we have enough circumstantial evidence to achieve an outcome or achieve a decision off of the information that we have, and an anti-theist or non-theist would simply say it's either not sufficient or the evidence would point to the contrary. I personally think that you have a stronger position to say that the evidence isn't strong enough to try to say that the evidence would point to the contrary, because I feel like that's a much, much harder position to defend as an anti-theist rather, versus a non-theist would just simply say it's not sufficient. Okay, and so this also is relevant in near-death experiences, and the reason I'm so focused on this train of thought this week is because I just got done reading Jeffrey Long's God in the Afterlife, and in Jeffrey Long's book, this is kind of a catalog of people's experiences who interacted directly with God and had conversations, and then he kind of overviewed what kind of information we could gain from those conversations. So it is an interesting book in the sense that it talks about a lot of the experiences people have directly with God. However, it's a very controversial book in the sense that it refers to a lot of the on the fringes type conversations that people are having, meaning that the conversations that they're having are maybe 1%, 2% at best of near-death experiences overall. So what these people are experiencing is very specific in comparison to what the majority of near-death experiences are. And so, in that sense, we need to be very, very diligent when looking at near-death experiences, just like we do any field. We need to be very diligent in the way that we study them, the way that we look at the evidence for them, and the way that we interpret that evidence to give us a particular outcome, especially when that outcome pertains to apologetics. And so ultimately, this is why I'm so stuck in on the conversation, because there are things that are mentioned within the book that are really cool, and then there's things that are mentioned in the book that are very controversial, heretical in some senses, you could say. And that's not the first time for that to happen within near-death experiences. I mean, it's common for you to come across an experience that has some on the fringes statements that they want to make. And so that's when you have to pull out this right here, okay? You have to look at the direct evidence. You have to look at the circumstantial evidence. So near-death experience itself is based on personal knowledge or observation. So it would be considered a form of direct evidence. And that's why I personally think it's so strong, because it's one of the very few pieces of direct evidence that we have. I would say that the Bible also qualifies as direct evidence. This would be people directly having conversations with God, and then saying, I had a conversation with God and this is what it entailed. Now, circumstantial evidence is primarily what you're going to find within apologetics, right? Like philosophical arguments, cosmological-based arguments. You're going to run into biological-based arguments, moral arguments. So you're going to have all these different fields in which you can argue for God, okay? Or argue against God. And ultimately, we as people can never really get to a dead set outcome. We have to consider the evidence that's given, and then from there make a decision based on the evidence that's given. Now, to further allow for clarification between the two, okay? So a witness may directly view a killing, that is direct evidence, or testify that he or she viewed the defendant flee from the crime scene. That's circumstantial evidence. So if you need a little more help here, one person saw the action happen, okay? Without a doubt, they saw the action happen. And now you have to kind of look at the integrity of the person telling the story versus the circumstantial evidence, which, of course, the objection I just made would qualify over here as well. But the circumstantial evidence is I saw him fleeing from the scene of where the person was killed. That connects him to the scene, he or she to the scene, but it doesn't necessarily... You didn't necessarily see him commit the crime. Perhaps he was just in the building, heard a weapon go off, heard a firearm go off, and was like, "Hey, I'm getting out of here. I'm not trying to be shot." So, those are that's an additional clarification of the two, and how that plays into the role that we use them with near-death experiences. Now, these are some of the questions I personally ask. Okay, whenever I get to a point of kind of looking at these near-death experiences, I always ask these questions of what did the other testimonies have to say? Are there direct contradictions? Can these contradictions be reconciled in any way? What I mean is, yes, you will find contradictions in people's stories, but there are contradictions that are reconcilable and there are contradictions that are non-reconcilable, meaning that they are in stark contrast to one another, versus there are contradictions that may appear contradictory, but upon further investigation, you find that they are just two sides of one coin, as it were. So it depends on what side of the coin you're looking at, on what kind of, whether you're seeing heads or tails. However, from a person who is able to see both sides of the coin, you're able to confirm that that is in fact a coin and not just a coin with heads or a coin with tails, if that makes sense. And then what does medical evidence have to say? Of course, there are people who claim to have near-death experiences that are very much having hallucinations. I know that I've kind of debunked that in some former videos, but I do want to bring attention to that here. It is definitely something that happens, and it is something that needs to be taken into consideration when evaluating what someone says happened within their near-death experience. And then, is this a common experience or is this an outlier? That's kind of the big one that I mentioned previously of if someone is saying that they had an experience and that particular experience is an outlier in the sense that it has elements in it that are just not very, very common. For example, you'll have near-death experiencers say, hey, I had a conversation with God, and he said it doesn't matter what religion you follow, they're all going to get you there. Now, that is a strong statement, right? It's a strong statement because it does seem to go against the knowledge that we have here from Christian revelations. Now, that being said, if it was reported more and more, you would add validity every time it was reported. However, it's not very common and therefore not very reliable. And so it could be true, it could not be true. But we have to kind of go with, if 80 people have a near-death experience and one of them comes back, right? Or we'll say 80 people have a near-death experience. Let's say 40 of them meet God, and then we'll say that 2 of them talk to God about specifically religion, okay? And one of them talks to God and says, whatever's going to lead you there is ultimate, or whatever religion you have is ultimately going to get you the closest to God. And then you have another one that says, okay, well, God said that whatever gets me closest to Jesus or him in particular. So it's a religion that focuses on God. So I know those are kind of a very nuanced difference, but ultimately what I'm just trying to point out is that you have this large case of near-death experiences, and then you have this tiny component of it that just really, it's like 3% of the experience. It just simply, I don't know if my math's right there, but just to point out, it's just a small portion of it. And so it's difficult when you compare that to, say, like people going to Disneyland, okay? And this is going to be a best way to describe it. is people are going to Disneyland, and you have 80 people go to Disneyland. And then of the 80 people, 40 people came back and said they met Mickey Mouse, and they had a conversation with Mickey Mouse. And they described their conversations. And then 2 of those people out of the 40 people talk about this really in-depth conversation they had with Mickey Mouse, and how Mickey Mouse revealed certain things to them that might seem contradictory toward the other person's conversation they had with Mickey Mouse. And so the 2 testimonies you have are kind of going against one another, and they're also kind of outliers from the other 80 testimonies that you received of Disneyland. So that's really what you're up against when you are looking at near-death experiences and looking at apologetics in general, is that you're considering the evidence from a lot of different sources, and you're trying to arrive at some kind of meta form of information, meaning that you're trying to take this all these different experiences, all these different inputs of information, and then combine them into these overall statistical pieces of information that can be confirmed by the majority. And the reality is that near-death experiences get a lot of cold water, right? They get a lot of cold water poured on them. Shout out to Char there. They get a lot of cold water poured on them because of the idea that they're saying something that's so what appears to be heretical. And therefore, they try to say that all near-death experiences qualify in this sense. And as someone who looks into a lot of near-death experiencers, and Dr. Miller and I have been having this conversation over the last week, and I really appreciate him clarifying a lot of these things with me and for me, is you have to have this vigilance in which you are careful in what information you're going to disseminate out from that near-death experience, or what you're going to take out of that near-death experience. You can't necessarily just take it all for what they say and then be like, this is the fact, even though it might contradict some other fields of apologetics. And that's kind of the thing I'm trying to do with these near-death experiences, is not just consider them and the Bible, but also consider them, the Bible, moral arguments, philosophical arguments, all these arguments that might pertain to a near-death experience, because ultimately I want to see, again, coherence and consistency in the 4 major questions we want to answer as apologists, which is origin, meaning, morality, and destiny. So I just wanted to make this video for you guys to say, when you're considering information, when you're considering evidence, when you're out there and you're just trying to explore what scientists have to say about God or no God, or near-death experiences have to say about what God's trying to say, and when you're out there investigating, just always remember that you're getting bits and bits and bits of information, and that you want to get to the point where you can grab all this information and get a coherent and consistent view that allows all of these fields to work together. And that's ultimately what we should have, is that God reveals himself in truth, and truth is found in all of these fields. And then when you get this coherent and consistency across all the fields, I feel like you find that truth, and ultimately you find God. So that's this week's video. Thank you guys. I know it's a short one, but it was just on my mind. I had to get it out there. I had to talk about it. I know it's something that I know people think about it. I think about it. And I just wanted to make that clarification for everybody out there. So if you enjoyed this week's video, do me a favor, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button. Those would be massive helps. Do you disagree? Do you agree? Like, what do you guys think about this video? Comment below. That would be a big help to me. And in the meantime, keep on pondering.